Next speaker is Jamie Notter from Human Workplaces. He's speaking on using culture to drive innovation. A few fun facts about Jamie are since 2007, Jamie has ridden his bicycle more than 21,000 miles. That's 5.3 times around the earth. Pretty impressive. And Jamie went to junior high and high school with Louis C.K. and Matt LeBlanc from Friends, known as Joey. So I can't resist. Let's all give him a big, how you doing?
Do you think right now that like Louis C.K. and Matt LeBlanc are telling someone, I went to high school with Jamie Notter? I don't think so. But anyway, I used to think that having the after lunch slot was the worst as a speaker, but now I'm thinking the before cocktails slot is a challenge. So I'm going to try and go through this stuff really quickly so I'm not getting in the way of cocktail hour. But we're going to talk about culture and specifically how culture ties to innovation. I know innovation's come up a few times today, and I have a simple definition of innovation. Innovation is change that unlocks new value. Okay, it's not about just change that creates value. That's just change. That's fine. Innovation is doing change that gets at stuff that you can't get at without changing the rules of the game. Okay, and it's hugely important. And I hear a lot of organizations, particularly in this day and age, telling me we need more innovation. We need to get access to that kind of value. Which is true, and then they immediately give me excuses why they can't. The excuses are, we don't have the resources for innovation. We don't have the resources to do this. We're not Google. We're not, fill in the blank. And I don't buy that, by the way. Whatever resources you have, those are the ones you'll use. Like, that's it. There are plenty of organizations that beat other organizations around innovation who had more to invest. It's not about the amount you invest, it's about doing it right. And then I get the excuse of, we don't have the genius. You got to be a genius to have innovation. And I don't buy that either. I think that the work of innovation is stuff that we all know how to do. So that's not it. What they don't often tell me, and I end up telling them, is, what the number one obstacle to innovation in your organization is your culture. Okay? We have created cultures that we unwittingly get in the way of innovation, and we don't see that because from on high, the senior leaders are telling us over and over again, we need innovation, we're going to do it, I'm going to create this innovation program. Like, we get the lip service that we're behind it, and then it doesn't work because the culture ends up undermining it. Now, if we're going to talk about culture, then I got to give you my culture definition. And I actually was challenged a couple years ago. People said, oh, culture, it's so vague, it's so hard to define, it's kind of squishy. I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually really simple. It's the collection of words, actions, thoughts, and sorry for the technical term here, stuff that clarify and reinforce what's really valued in your organization, right? It's the words we use to describe the culture, that's part of it, but then you got to make sure the words are consistent with the behaviors, because if you say your culture is one thing and then you do something else as a leader, the behaviors will define it. Sometimes it's the thoughts, which are like the underlying mental models and assumptions we have, and the stuff is the tangible pieces, the way you design your office, your dress code, anything that is physical. Like, all of that stuff gets combined to define what's really valued inside your organization. And I will challenge you, there's a lot you have to do there to manage culture, but I'll challenge you on the words piece. Because part of what is making your culture real in your organization are the words you use to describe it, right? And so my favorite place for capturing how we describe a culture is during the job interview. Have you interviewed people for jobs? And you're peppering them with questions and finding out about their experience. Eventually, then, you turn it back over to them. So, do you have any questions for us? What do they ask? What's the culture like here? What do you say? Think about how you would answer that question for your organization. Because you know what I hear a lot when I ask people that question? They're like, oh, our culture's great, actually. It's an awesome culture. We have a strong culture, good culture here. Or my favorite ones, I get the family metaphor. Do you guys use the family metaphor? We're like a family here. Yeah, you know what the number one word in the English language is associated with family is dysfunctional. Okay? You're trying to lure me into your organization and you're telling me it's like a family? You obviously don't know my family, okay? So we're very imprecise in the words we use to describe culture, okay? When I say what's your culture like here, I want you to say, look, we are like rabidly focused on collaboration here. We are always putting people on cross-functional teams. We're constantly working together. We redesigned our whole office space to make sure everyone's around each other and they can hear what's going on. If you're the kind of person that just wants to put on your headphones and do your work by yourself, you're not going to like it here, right? I need that level of precision. And by the way, that doesn't mean you have to have a collaborative culture. You could say, we are radically siloed here. We stay in our swim lanes and we do not get out of them because we know that when we stay in the swim lanes, we're faster. And being fast is how we beat the competition. So if you're someone who wants to go be on cross-functional teams and work with other people and sit in the big table and work together, you're not going to like it here, okay? The answer you choose will vary, but I want that kind of specificity if you're going to do it. If you're going to want to be able to use culture specifically to drive innovation, okay? Now, getting to that level of specificity, to be able to say this is exactly how we do it here, requires you to understand your own culture at a level that we don't particularly do. You can't just say we're a strong culture, we're a family culture, and I put truly valued, by the way, and not the word core values. I didn't put values in there because, don't get me started on the core value. Do you guys have core values? You do? Are you being honest? Okay. Let me guess. Quality, excellence, family, who's got honesty and integrity in their core values? If you have it in your core values, you literally have to raise your hand. Otherwise, you're violating your own core values. Okay? Who's got honesty and integrity in your core values? Okay, I want to congratulate you for distinguishing yourselves from all those companies that value lying and deceit. Right? We go to lowest common denominator and say, well, we all value this stuff, so let's put it up there. It doesn't differentiate us, and most importantly, it doesn't drive behavior. Right? You know who had honesty and integrity in their core values? Enron. Remember Enron? They had it on the wall in the lobby, honesty and integrity. But that's clearly not what was valued there. What was valued is making your numbers, even if you have to make a large accounting firm lie about it. Right? And so I don't know what they did, words, actions, thoughts, and stuff, to make it clear that that's what was valued, but they did, because that's the behavior they got. So you have to look at a deeper level about what's really valued in your culture. And when it comes to innovation, this requires that you need to understand the patterns of what's valued inside your culture. Because if I ask you, do you value innovation? Most people are going to be like, yeah, like we love innovation. We're an innovative company, right? I don't want that answer. I want the detailed one, which means you have to be able to see the culture patterns, okay? And so when we measure culture using the WorkXO assessment, innovation is broken down into 8 specific building blocks, okay? Creativity, inspiration, permission to hack, continuous improvement, that's getting past the we've always done it that way excuse, right? Future focus, taking risks, running experiments, doing beta testing, prototyping, that kind of thing. Every culture has all of these things in it at a particular level. It's either very present in the culture or not present at all or somewhere in between. And that's what the numbers refer to in the graph. So in this particular organization, they really do value creativity. A high score there means when we asked everyone, they said, yeah, I get to be creative in my work like all the time, okay? But when we said, hey, do you guys beta test internally or externally? They're like, no, we don't do that very much. And that's fine. I mean, part of the challenge is not just, I like what the last guy said, like, it's not just the data. You got to sort of pull out the conclusions from this. But what we don't do, and what I would advocate doing, is focusing on the patterns. And so here's the pattern that I saw with this particular organization. The concepts of innovation are really valued here. It's really present. We get to be creative. We do inspirational work. We get past the we've always done it that way excuse. Future focus I could have lumped in there as well. Like, you need those concepts in your culture if you're going to do innovation well. But what they hadn't realized is the action side of innovation is not as valued. It's not as present in the culture. They don't as much run experiments, take risks, and make sure failure is okay, and particularly doing the beta testing, right? And so I asked the management team, I said, is this getting in the way of your success? Is this a part of your culture that is making it harder for you to do the innovation you need to do? And they actually weren't particularly worried about the testing new ideas. In their particular industry, they didn't feel like their customers were used to seeing these unfinished products and testing them. So they're like, that didn't worry them. But they expected the experimentation and risk-taking to be up along with the conceptual side. And they said that's probably a problem. But they also pointed out a sort of another angle to this pattern, which is permission to hack is actually part of the action part of innovation, right? Like hacking, permission to hack says if I want to change something that I'm working on or a process, my manager's going to back me up. Or we can hack stuff here. And so they got a 7.1 on that. That's pretty present in the culture. And I asked the management team, it's my favorite when I'm debriefing culture data, it's my favorite point in the debrief where I get to the what's up with that moment. You know, like, hey, what's up with this? Like, you can hack stuff, but you don't take risks, you don't run experiments? Like, well, what's going on? And the CEO said, oh, I'll tell you exactly why that's going on. Because you can hack by yourself. You can hack within your individual work stream, right? You can hack within your team, but as soon as it's an experiment that might have visible sort of results or a risk that would show some failure that other people are going to see, like that's too hard to do or it's not as supported in the culture. And so this organization actually did innovation pretty well. What they didn't realize until they saw the data is they had created all these little stovepipes of innovation, right? Like every team is doing cool, innovative stuff all within their own team. And so they're making progress in their team, and this team's making progress over there. And by the time they share their results, they realize we missed an opportunity to collaborate on this project like 6 months ago, right? They're leaving money on the table because they've created these stovepipes of innovation where everyone in the organization feels like they're being very innovative and they're actually doing some pretty good stuff, but they're missing opportunities because of the stovepipe innovation. Seeing that kind of pattern is critical to creating a culture that gets you where you need to go in terms of innovation. Now, that's sort of the problem when our culture patterns are sort of messing with our success. The solution then is to write and run what we call a playbook, a culture playbook that fixes the culture patterns. I kind of have to apologize for calling it a playbook, like really the most boring metaphor in all of business, the playbook. But I kind of like a playbook when it comes to culture and culture change. If you've built a culture that has these established patterns that need to change, you're going to have to run a bunch of plays. You know what I mean? This is not something where you just do a declaration and say, we are now no longer going to innovate in stovepipes, be done with it. You're going to have to run plays. You're going to have to change stuff. You're going to have to change the way you do things. And some of your plays aren't going to work. And so you got to pull them out and revise them and put them back in. Some of the plays only work for a little bit, and that's fine. They're just designed to get some momentum. Some of them are long-term. They're big investments. Like you're going to want to mix. So you're going to want a playbook of plays that are going to shift the culture patterns to make you more successful. Now, our model for the playbook, we have 6 sort of sections to the playbook. You don't have to have plays in every area. And the top 3 is where I start with the top 3 because these are sections of your playbook that are available to anyone in the organization. Like you don't have to be the CEO to develop a play in a playbook. You can be running it within your department, within your area. And that means changing either a process, a structure, or some sort of new design, or use of a technology. Okay, these are where I see most of the plays in a playbook that are going to shift a culture is just change a process you have. Your whole organization is basically a big bunch of processes. So you know what? Change the ones that will actually move the needle on whatever culture pattern you're trying to fix. Okay? Structure and design refers to both like organizational structure, org charts and reporting relationships and decision-making authority, that kind of thing. But it can also apply to actual physical office design, like particularly around collaboration. The whole open office thing is a play in a playbook to create a more collaborative environment. And then technology is either employing new technology or using the technology you have currently in a different way that will shift the patterns. And again, some of these can be big plays, some of them can be small, but a manager at any level can pretty much choose something to work on in one of these areas. A couple of examples. So my favorite process play, if you're like this organization that I was talking about before, and you wanted more experimentation, right? You realized from a pattern point of view, we're not valuing experiments. It's just not happening as much as we thought it would, even though we're committed to innovation. What process could you change to make that happen? The simplest one I could come up with is add experiment metrics to your dashboard. Like, that's it. You've got a dashboard, managers are reporting numbers up every month, every quarter. So make them report 2 numbers that they didn't report before. Number 1, how many experiments did you run last month or last quarter? Number 2, what percentage of them failed? If you have your managers report those 2 numbers on a regular basis, I guarantee you that some of the managers are going to have zeros. And guess what's going to happen? Someone's going to go talk to that manager. Why do you have zeros? Oh, I couldn't run any experiments. No, like, we just put this on our dashboard. It's a commitment for the organization. You need to run experiments. That manager then goes back to their people and says, we got to run some experiments because I'm in trouble if we don't, right? They're like, well, we don't want to run experiments. It takes us away from our work. It makes it hardest. They'll have excuses about why. But if it's an organizational commitment, you're like, I got to make my numbers. Give me an easy experiment, something. And so they'll come up with something. It's maybe not groundbreaking, but suddenly they're doing an experiment. One process change, you add those 2 numbers to your dashboard, and behavior changes, okay? By the way, the zero experiments is on there, but 0% failure is on there, because if you run a lot of experiments and they all succeed, like, you're doing it wrong, okay? You're only doing stuff you already know how to do. So that 0% failure gets me to talk to a manager too, like, all right, I need you to expand your scope a little in terms of the experiments you're running. So a simple process change generates real behavior change. Under technology, I can't imagine if there's a technology anywhere that we know of where you could actually put ideas in and, like, vote them up and down. Wouldn't that be weird? Wouldn't that be cool if we had that? So I know, you should look into that. Idea management software. I tell this to everybody. I mention Idea Scale. It's relatively, you tell me, it's relatively easy to implement, right? You get this in your organizations where people can put ideas out. This one would be particularly important for the organization that's got the stovepipe silos, right? Because nobody knows that someone has this idea to do what I'm already doing. But when those ideas start getting out there and voted on, now that money that was being left on the table is now being captured. Because earlier on in the innovation process, they're able to collaborate on this stuff because they realize they're already working on it, but they didn't know that before. And that's, again, a pretty simple technology to implement that would generate different behaviors and sort of solve that culture pattern. Now, the bottom 3 in the playbook are a little bit longer term and a little bit more centralized. So when you're changing culture, talent and HR is always a part of the culture change, right? I mean, if you're going to change culture, it's going to have implications for the way you do your hiring, the way you do your performance reviews. So talent and HR gets its own sort of bucket in the culture change playbook because they need to manage that piece. Rituals and artifacts is more about how do you communicate your culture. So I've talked about the words we use. I mean, you need to actually create some rituals inside your organization and tangible artifacts that you can share around that make it clear what's valued inside your culture. That's kind of long-term sustainability of the culture change effort. And it's often done also through sort of the HR world. And then stewardship is more about, not about the specific ways that your culture is shaped, but it's about how you do the work of culture management, right? Like, culture management, who are the stewards of your culture? Who's paying attention to how your culture patterns are changing? Who's looking at what progress you've made in solving this problem around stovepiped innovation? There have to be people that are doing that, processes that are used for that, systems that support that. That's the work of culture management. And I actually think that's as much of a challenge as the organizational challenge that the last speakers talked about. We're not investing in the development and nurturing and sustainable support of a culture that it drives your success. And so there's a whole set of plays around that. Again, that's long term. But even within the longer term sections of the playbook, I'll give you another example around innovation that would relate just within talent and HR. And this would be implementing something like Google's classic 20% time, right? That's changing people's job descriptions. You remember Google's 20% time, right? 20% of their time they could spend on any project they want. Yes, they weren't the only ones to do it. They didn't invent it, but they got a lot of press for it. I tell people this. I really still, even though this happened, they're like, yeah, but no, it didn't really happen. Who would do that? I'm like, no, seriously. 4 days a week, you're on your core job. 1 day a week, you work on any project you want. You got to tell your boss what you're working on, but you don't need their approval, right? And people are like, oh, we have a version of 20% time. It's called 120% time. 100% of the time, you do your job. And 20% of your weekend, feel free to experiment on whatever you want. But like Gmail came out of somebody's 20% time at Google, right? At least that's what I was told. I mean, if you had gone, back in the day, if you'd gone to Google, you're working at Google and you go to your boss and they didn't have 20% time, you're like, hey, I think we should come up with an email platform. The manager is going to say, no, we are not in that business. We are search and AdWords and we're making tons of money and I need you doing that. It's like, this would have been back in the day. We can't compete with AOL, you know? Isn't that funny? Because they literally would have said that, right? So they're not in the email business, but because they gave space for the 20%, they got the experiment, they got the innovation, they unlocked the value that they couldn't get, okay? And they only got it by giving that space. And I feel like, there's plenty of ways. You don't have to do 20%. You can do 10%. You can do 5%. You can do an innovation day. Who's it, Atlassian, that does they had FedEx Day. Like there was 1 day to come up with a prototype, something new. It absolutely has to be delivered overnight. They got a nice, polite, but sternly worded letter from FedEx lawyers once they blogged about that they can't call it FedEx Day anymore. But the point is you're giving people space to do the work, and that means changing job descriptions. And I actually think Maddie and I do a lot of work. We've done work with sort of big technology companies and little tiny nonprofits, and they all describe to me the same thing, which is we don't have time. And I feel like we are all running way too lean, right? This like the whole model of efficiency that he mentioned, right? We are so about efficiency that we don't make this happen or we think it can't happen. So it doesn't have to be 20%, it can be 5%. You can find ways to do it. But if you really want innovation, if you want to get access to that value you can't get at just by playing by the rules, you're going to have to give people some space to do it. So if you want to leverage culture in creating more innovation in your organization, or frankly, solving a lot of different problems in your organization, you got to understand the patterns and you have to develop a specific playbook of specific actions that, again, include some small stuff, some big stuff, some short-term, some long-term, and then stay on it, right? Keep doing it, keep managing it, and showing some progress. But I will say, sort of in closing on this, because I feel like I need a cocktail. The first step is getting really clear on what your culture is. And I feel like we don't want to do this or we're not good at it. Because if you bring up the concept of culture in your management team, they're going to say, that's true, culture's important. What is our ideal culture? What should our culture be? Right? We want to paint this really positive picture of what culture should be. And that's lovely. But if you don't paint a clear picture of what culture actually is, nobody's going to do what it takes to get to where you want it to be, right? This is a change management issue. If you go to someone and say, if you go to your team, your whole organization and say, I heard Jamie Notter talk, and he knows Matt LeBlanc, so you need to listen to him. We need to be a culture of innovation. We have stovepipe innovation, so here's the deal. We're gonna change this way. We're going to do these new things. You need to change your behavior in these ways. Everyone's going to say why they can't do that and give you the resistance and pushback. But if you can say, look, here's the deal. Here's how we've created our culture. It wasn't necessarily intentional, but we love the concepts. We don't really like the actions. We're all about hacking. We have these sort of stovepipes of stuff happening around innovation. Now, your people will be like, oh, that's so true. That is how we are. Now you've got them. You're like, but here's the deal. In our competitive environment, we're leaving money on the table with that stovepipe innovation, and I want us to be more successful. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, so here's the deal. I need you to behave differently. I need you to start reporting your experiments. I need you to start doing this, that, and the other. if you can make the case that starts with an accurate picture of what it's really like to work there, they will listen to your behavior change suggestions. But if you miss the what is, or ignore to say it's not that important, all that matters is our target, they can create stories about why it's not going to work. Okay? So in addition to innovation, how do you do agility in your organization? How do you do change? Where do you put decision-making authority? How do you do transparency? How do you do collaboration? My favorite one on collaboration is we're all about the human side of collaboration. We're good facilitators. We work well together. We help each other. That's lovely. We also have rigid silos. And you can't work with someone from that silo unless you get permission from somebody, right? Those kinds of contradictions, you got to be honest about what it's really like to do that. If you can paint that picture really clearly, then the action planning from there works. And if you skip painting that picture, then this is why everyone says culture change doesn't work or culture change is hard. I don't think it's hard if you do the right work, but you got to get this stuff done first. All right, questions? Did I leave any time for questions? Yes, in the back?
So I would say in terms of culture change, the most difficult thing to overcome is getting people to buy into, right, they want innovation, but they don't want to open up the risk factor, right? If you have a risk factor and you want innovation, you have to be open to failure, right? What do you say to that?
So, there's, you mentioned 3M, but there's another sort of innovation organization that we point to is Gore and Associates, right? They made Gore-Tex. And so they're totally known for innovation. It's a huge thing for them. But I heard the CEO of Gore speak, and she said, we have a phrase at Gore, which is, if you're going to punch holes in the boat, do it above the waterline. Okay? And so I feel like the risk and failure piece is because we're not creating clear boundaries about what you can experiment with and what you can't. Like, we need to paint some corners around what risk is okay. Like, you can experiment, but not with the core business model. You know what I mean? And so if you just toss it out there as you should risk more and failure is okay, that's not going to be true if you really screw things up badly. But if you can say, hey, here's your sandbox, and as you stay within these boundaries, knock yourself out, we can tolerate that kind of failure. But it requires a little more clarity, I think. Yeah?
So my organization is a big government federal agency, Defense Health Agency, and we're thinking about doing a governance board to funnel all these great ideas and decide and prioritize which ones they're going to do first.
Oh, the question is, what do I think of that? I was waiting for the question.
So, I mean, I think it creates some bottlenecks, but it's a large organization, and they're trying to avoid duplicative efforts.
Yeah, so, well, okay. I mean, so part of this is easy for me to be on the outside and say this, and part of it is I'm a consultant, therefore my answer is it depends. If I don't say that once a day, I lose my certification. So it's like, in theory, there are parts of that could work. I personally think I think the value you get out of the duplicative efforts outweighs the duplication, because when each group does it a little different way, you learn something new in the process. I think I tend to be more favored of a grassroots kind of approach on that one, and it also, I mean, this is a challenge. I mean, related to this, because it's just a large government organization. Part of my challenge, not just around innovation, but around like cultural agility, is that large organizations need to learn how to be small. And I know that there's a lot to be gained from scale. I'm not saying scale is irrelevant or not important, but I feel like we've kind of squeezed all the juice out of scale, and we haven't figured out how to sort of decentralize, but with guidance. You know what I mean? Like, one of the case studies from the book Maddie and I wrote called When Millennials Take Over is a healthcare company that manages to have a fluid organizational hierarchy. And if there's any organization, any industry that's hierarchical, it's healthcare, right? But in this organization, they have a traditional hierarchy, but they also have a rule that says the person in the room that knows the most about the hopes and dreams and aspirations of that patient gets listened to first. And because they've tied that directly to what makes them successful. Like they do brain injury and spinal cord injury rehabilitation. So the therapies they're doing have to connect to something personal inside that patient. If they don't stick. They know that. So they have that rule that guides them. So the idea of let's funnel the ideas up to a glorious body on high that will tell us which ones are right and then instruct us to do it. I'd rather have that body come up with really clear guidance on here's what makes us successful as an organization. Like when Maddie and I give our clients the culture data, the next question we said, okay, here are your patterns. So what makes you successful? Stopping makes me successful. They got a big sign in the back that said, stop. They were not settled, but I'll finish my sentence. When we ask them really what are your success drivers, what is the difference between this kind of performance and that kind of performance, and we get blank stares. If you double down your efforts to explain to your people what drives the success of this organization and then let them decide under that guidance, you'd unlock a lot more potential than sort of having the people on high make all the decisions. All right, with that note, I think we should drink. So thank you guys.